The Marine Corps has ordered a two-day pause in flight operations following a mishap involving an F-35 fighter jet. The plane went missing after the pilot ejected over Charleston, South Carolina on Sunday.
At 0317 local time, a Marine Corps F-35B climbed off the deck of USS America, banked hard northeast, and disappeared into a cloud ceiling sitting at 4,000 feet over the South China Sea. Underneath the jet, bolted to the centerline station, was the ugly part. The part the aviation press spent a decade calling the F-35B's original sin, the GPU-9/a-gun pod. From a distance, it looks like somebody welded a gray trash can to the belly of a $109 million stealth fighter because they forgot to plan ahead. From inside a Chinese naval task group 73 nautical miles to the northeast, it was about to look like something else entirely. The People's Liberation Army Navy Surface Action Group had been holding position for 11 hours. 3 destroyers, 2 frigates, 1 Type 055 cruiser. The Type 055, called the Renhai class, displaces 12,000 tons and carries 112 vertical launch cells for missiles ranging from surface-to-air interceptors to anti-ship cruise missiles. It cost the Chinese government roughly $900 million per hull. Against this group, someone had sent a drone. A BQM-167 subsonic target drone repurposed as a sensor mule, $5.7 million worth of aluminum tubing and GPS, cruising at 460 miles per hour at 500 feet. The drone's job was not to survive. Its job was to wake everybody up and make them start counting inventory. Every time a HHQ-9B surface-to-air missile lifted off a Chinese destroyer, it cost somebody $3.1 million. The drone had already triggered 7 of them on its way in. The math was not China's friend, and the drone hadn't even done anything yet. That was the problem the Marines had been handed. Not the cruiser. Not the destroyers. The thing sitting in the water 41 nautical miles northwest of the cruiser, radar dark and low in the chop, which the drone sensors had just mapped with enough detail to ruin somebody's entire career. A converted civilian vessel carrying mobile command infrastructure. No weapons. No hull markings that meant anything. The kind of target that if you hit it with a precision-guided bomb in front of the international press, produces a very long and exhausting conversation. The kind of target where what you actually need is something that can get close enough to be impolite on a surgical scale without turning the surrounding water into a United Nations agenda item. The list of aircraft that can do that from an amphibious ship at night through weather without a catapult is short enough to be funny. 60 nautical miles southwest, USS America was already recovering its first pair of clean jets. Clean meaning no pod, no external anything, pure stealth configuration, smooth belly, flush stores, signature reduced to the point where the radar cross-section of the F-35B in full stealth trim is roughly the size of a metal golf ball traveling at Mach 1.6. On the first pass over the task group, 2 clean jets had spent 22 minutes inside Chinese radar coverage without a single targeting lock. They had mapped every emitter, every thermal bloom, every antenna rotation rate on all 6 ships. They had fed that data forward without ever being seen. Then they came home. The jet in the air now was not clean. The GU-22/A is a 4-barrel 25mm Gatling cannon. It fires at up to 3,300 rounds per minute, which works out to 55 rounds every single second. Muzzle velocity with the PGU-32/U semi-armor piercing high-explosive incendiary tracer round reaches 3,560 feet per second. The recoil force averages 3,700 pounds per firing cycle. Think of it as a very precise industrial argument delivered at the speed of sound. Think of it less as a gun and more as a machine that converts electricity and gunpowder into a very firm policy statement. The pod carries 220 rounds. That is the part every aviation journalist has used to ridicule the F-35B since 2015. 220 rounds total. The F-35A, the Air Force version, has an internal gun with 182 rounds, and nobody mocks that because it at least has the decency to stay inside the airframe. The Marine version had to move the gun outside because the lift fan, the vertical landing hardware, the thing that lets an F-35B land on a ship without an arresting wire, eats the entire internal bay where the gun would have lived. Physics voted. The gun moved outside. The journalists voted. They called it a fundamental flaw. The Marines nodded politely and kept flying. What the journalists were right about was this: 220 rounds is not a lot of rounds. At the GAU-22's maximum rate, it lasts 4 seconds. The Marine answer to that critique has always been, yes, which is why we do not intend to use all of them on one target. 73 nautical miles northeast of America, the Chinese task group's radar picture was now carrying 14 separate contacts. 8 of those were real, 2 were American, 6 were commercial shipping, 6 were ghost tracks created by jamming from an EA-18G Growler that nobody in the task group had located yet because it was 110 nautical miles south and not particularly interested in being found. The task group's commander was not certain which 6 were ghosts and which 8 were real, and that uncertainty was the entire product being delivered. What the task group commander didn't know was that the converted command vessel to his northwest had already stopped transmitting. Not because it was hit. Because the two clean jets that spent 22 minutes overhead had recorded every emission from its antenna farm, and somebody in an intelligence cell on America had sent a very quiet message to a very quiet unit that did not need to be discussed further, and the command vessel's crew had made a prudent decision about their continued health. The vessel went dark at 0309 local time, 8 minutes before the pod jet lifted off. That decision gave the vessel exactly the wrong kind of visibility. A ship that has been transmitting command traffic for 11 hours and then goes completely silent in the middle of an active standoff does not become invisible. It becomes a lighthouse with the bulb removed. Everyone who was watching the traffic knows exactly where the silence is. The pilot of the F-35B knew where the silence was. The AN/AQ-37 distributed aperture system feeds 6 infrared sensors into the pilot's helmet simultaneously. The ocean at night is cold. Engines are not. Electrical systems are not. A ship running auxiliary power for communications equipment, even with its antennas down, produces a thermal signature that looks nothing like open water when you are looking at it through 6 eyes that can see temperature differences measured in fractions of a degree. The pilot found the vessel at 31 nautical miles. He had not planned to find it this early. The picture just arrived in the helmet like an answer to a question he hadn't finished asking. 22 nautical miles south of the vessel, the Marine pilot came off altitude and descended to 600 feet. The pod adds drag. That is real. The F-35B in full stealth configuration is genuinely harder to detect than the pod version, and at 600 feet doing 480 miles per hour through a cloud layer with an ugly gray canoe bolted under its belly, this aircraft was not pretending to be invisible. It was pretending to be a problem nobody in the task group had budgeted for. Which, as strategies go, was working. The task group's frigate closest to the command vessel was 19 nautical miles southeast of it and heading northeast on a patrol pattern. Frigate, not destroyer. The HHQ-16 surface-to-air system on a Type 054A frigate has an engagement range of roughly 40 kilometers, which is 25 miles. The Marine pilot was inside that envelope. He was not worried about the frigate in the way a normal briefing would expect him to be worried about the frigate, because the Growler 110 miles south had been doing something very specific to the frigate's fire control radar for the past 19 minutes, and the frigate's radar operators were currently experiencing an evening they would describe for years at retirement dinners. The pilot descended to 400 feet and the vessel filled the helmet. 162 feet long. Low superstructure aft. Communications arrays folded down along the mast. 3 figures on the deck near the bow, and one of them was pointing northeast because they had heard the jet's engines and correctly determined that the sound was not going away. Somewhere in Fort Worth, a design compromise was about to become the most precise 25mm argument in the history of the South China Sea. The pilot fired once. Not at the figures. At the mast junction, where the base of the folded antenna array met the deck housing. 40 rounds. Less than a second. The rounds punched through the mast housing, detonated in the equipment bay below, and turned the entire communications infrastructure of a $900 million naval command network into a very expensive pile of memories. He was already past the vessel when the secondary fires started. 31 nautical miles behind him, the task group's Type 055 cruiser finally got a radar lock. On what exactly, they were not certain. The return was small and inconsistent and traveling at 480 miles per hour at 400 feet, which described roughly 0 aircraft in the regional threat catalog. The Rinhai's combat system offered 3 possible classifications. 2 of them were wrong. The third required someone to make a very consequential phone call. That phone call took 4 minutes to complete. The F-35B was 61 nautical miles away when the phone call ended. China had just spent $21.7 million in surface-to-air missiles attempting to kill a drone that was already out of fuel, and the actual threat had arrived from underneath the radar floor on a ship they thought they understood and left carrying a gun everybody agreed was a Flaw. 41 nautical miles northwest of the task group, 2 things were now happening simultaneously, and neither of them was supposed to be the main event. The first was a Chinese electronic warfare vessel that had been sitting dark 90 nautical miles to the north, monitoring the entire exchange, suddenly began transmitting a burst communication. 12 seconds long, then dark again. What went into that burst was not recoverable in real time, but the direction it pointed and the compression signature identified it as targeting data. Someone was attempting to pass a fire solution to a platform that could use it. The second thing was a Marine MV-22B Osprey, call sign Greystone 11, lifting off the deck of USS America with 24 Marines of the 15th Marine Expeditionary Unit aboard. Their destination was not the command vessel. Their destination was a small uninhabited island 38 nautical miles northeast of the task group that had, in the past 6 hours, developed a very interesting collection of temporary structures and very fresh vehicle tracks running down to a fuel dock. The fuel dock was not Chinese military infrastructure. It was leased civilian infrastructure. That distinction was precisely why it had not appeared on anyone's initial target deck. It was also precisely why it mattered more than the destroyers. The task group was not loitering. It was fueling an operational tempo. Every day it stayed on station. Something on that island was keeping it there. Marines find those problems clarifying. 43 nautical miles west of the island, a second pod F-35B lifted from America's deck and turned northeast. This one was not carrying 220 rounds of 25mm. It had expended nothing yet. That was the point. The first jet had spent its gun. The second jet was fresh. This was the answer to the critics who said 220 rounds was a fatal limitation. It was not a limitation if you planned the loadouts right. One jet goes in and shaves the problem. The second jet goes in if the problem has opinions about the shaving. The island's fuel infrastructure had opinions. 2 trucks were running. A generator shed was hot. 3 individuals near the dock were doing things with hoses that suggested operational urgency. The second pilot got the picture from the first jet's data link, which was still orbiting outside engagement range because the Marine Corps does not like wasting sensors just because a gun runs dry. The second pilot came in from the northwest at 300 feet. The gun spoke twice. First the generator shed, then the truck nearest the dock. The shed caved and the electrical fire inside it did the rest. The truck caught through the fuel cap and produced a secondary that removed any ambiguity about what had been in the bed. The third individual near the dock made what was, under the circumstances, a very rational personal decision and entered the water. The F-35B does not chase swimmers. It is not that kind of system. The dock remained physically intact. That was deliberate. Intelligence wanted a look at what got offloaded there before the Ospreys arrived. 6 minutes behind the second jet, Greystone 11 crossed the island's beach at wave height and flared hard onto a shelf of flat rock 200 meters inland from the dock. The Marines were off the ramp before the rotors stopped washing. Security element left. Assault element straight. 2 men to the dock. 4 men inland toward the structures. 1 team holding the high ground on the western ridge where the vehicle tracks bent south. What they found at the dock was not fuel drums. Well, some of it was fuel drums. But underneath the netting, strapped to a pallet that had been rolled off a civilian fishing tender sometime in the past 18 hours, was a system the intelligence officers on America had been looking for in 3 other locations for 9 days. A mobile surface-to-ship missile battery. Launcher folded down for transport. 2 reload canisters still sealed. Crew nowhere visible. Which meant the crew had made the same rational decision as the individual near the dock and was now somewhere in the water north of the island making different career choices. The task group had not been there for a patrol. It had been there to validate the site, to confirm the battery was placed and functional before the task group moved on. The fuel pier was cover. The destroyers were cover. The 11 hours on station was the validation window, and by 03:17 local time, when the first Marine jet lifted from America's deck, it had been about to close. Somewhere in a regional headquarters, the next tasking order for the task group had already been written. It presumed the battery was operational. The Marines sent a photograph of the folded launcher to the intelligence cell on America. The intelligence cell sent a 1-line response. The task group's next tasking order became immediately less relevant. 100 nautical miles to the southwest, USS America was recovering jets and launching the follow-on package. 2 more clean jets. A second Osprey with engineers and an exploitation team. 1 EA-18G Growler for continuity of the jamming picture. The operational tempo of an America-class amphibious ship running a full F-35B package in Surge Ops is something the platform's original design documents describe in careful, measured language. The people who actually do it describe it differently. The word they use most often is relentless. At 0411 local time, everything converged. The task group, now missing its command vessel's communications, missing the fuel site's operational status, and missing the electronic warfare vessel's burst transmission because someone had thought to look at where the burst pointed and done something about it, was holding position on a decision that no longer had the information it required to make. 40 nautical miles northeast, Greystone 11 was back in the air with 3 Marines and a pallet of sealed missile canisters. The canisters went to America's intelligence spaces. The Marines went to the chow hall. The pallet was the real outcome of the evening. 16 nautical miles north of the island, the Type 055 cruiser's commander made the call that his superiors would later describe as prudent and that his communications officer would later describe using a different word. The task group turned southwest. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of movement that a very large ship makes when it has decided that the current position costs more than it returns. The traffic lanes northeast of the task group's former position opened by 0447. Container ships that had been holding speed for 6 hours resumed their headings. Somewhere in a maritime insurance office, a spreadsheet that had been performing poorly recovered slightly. The second pod jet recovered on America's deck at 0431 with 71 rounds remaining. Those 71 rounds were logged, accounted for, and scheduled for reuse. Nothing in the Marine Corps gets discarded because there might not be another use for it. The gun pod was unbolted from the centerline station, checked, rearmed, and placed on the flight deck available for the next jet that needed to ask a close-quarters question from a flat deck in the dark. 4 years earlier, a congressional staffer had written a memo arguing that the F-35B's external gun pod represented a structural failure in the aircraft's design philosophy. The memo cited drag penalties, signature increase, reduced internal fuel fraction, and the psychological impact on pilot confidence of carrying a visible external store on what was marketed as a low-observable aircraft. It was a thoughtful memo. It was not wrong about any of the specific claims it made. It also did not account for a night in the South China Sea when the only thing in theater that could launch from an amphibious ship, arrive below radar floor, see a command vessel's thermal signature through cloud cover at 31 nautical miles, and put 40 rounds of semi-armor-piercing high-explosive incendiary into a mass junction with surgical discipline was a $109 million stealth fighter wearing an ugly gray canoe. You cannot catapult an F/A-18 off a flat deck. You cannot hover a B-2. You cannot make a Reaper fire 55 rounds per second at 400 feet through weather into a single designated structure and be 61 nautical miles away before anyone has finished classifying the radar return. The list of things that can do all of that from an amphibious ship is one item long, and it has a bathtub bolted to it.
The flaw was the point.
It just took the right night to prove it. At 0503 local time, the first light touched the South China Sea and the task group was 62 nautical miles southwest of where it had been when the evening started. The command vessel was dead in the water. The fuel site was photographed, documented, and out of service. The missile battery was on an American ship. The traffic lanes were open. America was launching the morning CAP with the same flat deck it had launched the gun runs from, because that is what America-class ships do when they stop being underestimated. The Marine who had fired the dock generator sat in the ready room and was asked by his squadron commander how many rounds it took.
He checked the counter log.
40 rounds for the generator, 40 rounds for the truck,
80 rounds total.
out of 220. He had flown home with 140 left in the pod. His squadron commander said nothing for a long moment and then said that was the most expensive generator anyone in this squadron had ever killed. The pilot agreed. Then the pilot said the second most expensive was the truck. His squadron commander told him to get some sleep. The bathtub had cleared a task group, neutralized a hidden missile battery, and opened a shipping lane. That was not in the original design specifications. It rarely is. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on how the America-class ship became the most dangerous thing China didn't plan for. Bye for now.